tuition.
Hi, my name is Rand Park, and this is my presentation for EDPA 8732, Higher Ed Finance. The topic of my paper is the impact of differential tuition on student choice of major, implications for policy and practice. The first thing we need to do is define what is differential tuition. Differential tuition is not new. It's basically charging different tuition rates for different academic programs. It's very common between schools, between public and private institutions. And we're also quite used to differential tuition between levels of programs. For example, undergraduate tuition being at a different, usually lower rate than tuition for graduate or professional schools. The new trend, however, in differential tuition is charging different tuition rates for the different undergraduate programs at the same institution. So for example, at a university, a student who's majoring in history would pay a lower base tuition rate than a student who's majoring in business. Why would a school decide to charge differential tuition? Well, it's all about money. At the end of the day, the schools need more revenue to run certain programs. The reason these costs are higher are because of professor salaries, technical and equipment costs, especially in science and engineering, the inability to get state legislatures to approve overall tuition increases, and a necessity to keep up with private institutions in terms of spending. Another argument that's often made is that supply and demand makes it possible because, number one, there's a limit on capacity for some of these programs. And so there's an inability to bring in new students to cover those new costs with regular tuition. And the other piece that's behind many of these programs is the fact that because many students will make more money with certain degrees after graduation and their salaries will be higher, the idea is that it's okay for them to be able to carry a greater debt load. It would be less burdensome. And so that somehow softens the blow of the higher tuition rates. Now, there are some criticisms of differential tuition. First of all, the idea that differential tuition really cuts into the idea of what public good is versus private benefit. Many faculty members, many programs talk about this historic appreciation of students having the ability to choose whatever they want to study based upon their intellectual interest and not the cost. And if we look at the Morrill Land Grant Act, we see that there was this idea that it set up an expectation of public higher education as a public good to which all citizens should have access. There are other criticisms that include resource allocation and access decisions. For number one, the idea is that differential tuition may lead to the assumption that certain programs are more highly valued by their institutions. Secondly, we may see that many lower income students may disproportionately cluster in these less expensive fields where the tuition is lower. And finally, for some, this is a grave distress signal that the democratic mission of public universities is falling prey to market forces. So the particular question that we want to focus on here is differential tuition in public institutions. Now, in response to some of those criticisms, some of the things that institutions have done include limiting the amount of courses from higher tuition degree programs without penalty, so that if a student is a history major and wants to take a business class as an elective, for example, they would not have to pay a higher rate. It's also the case that some of the differential tuition additional monies are being used to fund enhanced financial aid for needy students in their programs. Finally, the revenue streams for the programs, because of responsibility-centered budgeting, many programs are responsible for managing their expenses, and the monies from differential tuition, for the most part, flow directly to those programs. And so it is proven to be successful in generating additional revenue for those programs with higher tuition. So the study purpose and research questions that I propose, number one, it's an open question and one that hasn't really been researched. Does the use of differential tuition by public colleges and universities have an effect on student choice of major at those institutions? Secondly, the question that I think is more of greater import in terms of social justice and the public nature of public higher education institutions is, does the use of differential tuition have a disparate impact upon low SES and historically underrepresented populations in fields with higher relative tuition? The stakeholders, college students, who may choose their major not based upon personal aptitude or interest, but based upon the purchasing decision, will they pay the higher tuition? College leaders and legislators who have a choice of differential tuition policies, and they may choose one and have an unintended negative impact on the very populations that they're designed to assist through their other programs on campus. And then finally, the general public, who may find that many of the more pressing workforce needs can no longer be met by graduates whose choices of major are affected by differential tuition. In other words, If you're carrying a much higher debt burden, there's a narrower range of fields into which you may choose to work in order to make higher salaries to pay off that debt. The first thing I did with regard to this proposal was do some data and information collection, and I did literature review. There are a lot of articles that are generally written that touch on the topic, but three sources that I found to be particularly helpful. First of all, Dill in 2003 had an article that I reviewed that really expanded on the idea of industrial economics and higher education and talking about market-based forces. Now, he didn't specifically refer to differential tuition, but in this particular argument, he reviewed two studies, one from Hawksby, one from the Rand Corporation, where he laid out the fact that market-based competition creates a ripe environment for a number of different market-based philosophies with regard to pricing, admissions, selectivity, program choices, and in my opinion, really sets the stage theoretically for why differential tuition policies are so exciting and so accepted by so many administrators. The second, and probably one of the best current documents in terms of overall survey of what's going on in the United States, is Glenn Nelson's dissertation from the University of Nebraska, his doctorate in education in 2008, where he surveyed 165 public institutions around the country. And noticed that the use of differential tuition is national and growing, but also points out that as of just last year, no research had been done to really examine the effect on student enrollment. Now, at the same time that Nelson was publishing his dissertation, Shin and Milton published an article where they had actually taken IPED's data and looked at whether or not differential tuition policies had effect in terms of tuition elasticity, which would mean if the tuition rates went up, that fewer numbers of students would enroll in those programs. And Shin and Milton found that just based on pure IPED's total head count, no demographic data, no SES data, and very little differentiation between types of institutions, found that students are elastic to tuition levels in subject areas like physics, biology, and business, but not in engineering. What that basically means is you can charge a lot more for engineering and it doesn't show up any fewer students in the program. I also looked at meeting minutes from the University of Wisconsin Board of Regents, who approved differential tuition for their business school, demonstrating the need, showing direct benefit, and having students testify. But I also looked at University of Minnesota Senate Committee on Finance and Planning just recently, a fairly long discussion around whether or not mandatory fees act as differential tuition. Do students game the system with differential tuition? No decision was made, but it was very interesting to see all the questions that were raised. I also did some faculty interviews wanting a really sort of open discussion with people not necessarily involved with differential tuition, but faculty members who were used to working with students. Asked them generally about it, found three very important things. For one faculty member, she was primarily concerned that differential tuition would send a negative message that some degrees were more valuable than others. The second professor that I spoke with talked about the fact that merit scholarships drive low SES students away from science, technology, and engineering and math fields where grades are lower and they can lose their scholarships. And finally, another professor that I spoke to said he actually thinks it should be the other way around. That if we want to encourage people to major in engineering and science, that we should actually charge lower tuition for those folks. So what do we know? We know the differential tuition policies are growing. The programs are most likely to be used are business and engineering. Programs that implement these policies do so generally within a responsibility-based budgeting model, and they do take some of those revenues and use them for financial aid. But what we don't know is how tuition rates can affect student choice of major in negative and unintended ways, compound barriers for low SES students, and signal that some of these programs are more valuable than others. So what I think we should do, there's two forms of research that I think that are called into here. First of all, a longitudinal study of both enrollment trends and student attitudes, sort of a combination of the NELS and the NESE surveys about these tuition policies. And also some in-depth interviews with decision makers, not just specifically about differential tuition like Nelson did for his dissertation, but about academic capitalism generally and whether or not it should be a primary goal for colleges and universities to generate revenue from their core educational research and service functions. The questions that implications we need to think about is, should we create these policies that create divisions and hierarchies on our campuses that really work against collegiality and collaboration? And should public institutions embark on a market-driven philosophy when private and nonprofit institutions can implement these programs without public subsidy? Thank you very much.